what type of flying do fatal accidents occur in the R-22 helicopter? Recreational flying constitutes 62% of the fatal accidents which occur in the R-22. Training, 20%. Business flying, 17%. You can see that nearly 2/3 of all the fatal accidents that occur in the R-22 helicopter occur during recreational flying or joyriding. Not because 2/3 of the flying that's being done is recreational flying. Actually, as near as we can determine, there's more flying being done in the training and business area than in the recreational area. But nevertheless, it's in the recreational or joyriding area that we have the vast majority of our fatal accidents. What are the primary causes of fatal accidents in the R-22? Well, number one, way above anything else, collision or flying into wires or other obstacles, 32%. Low RPM rotor stall, 22%. Weather, 14%. And low G mass pumping, 9%. These are the four primary causes of fatal accidents in the R-22 helicopter. Taking a closer look now at what is our number one cause of fatal accidents, collision or flying into wires, these are some of the things that we can do to reduce the chances of having that type of an accident. If you're flying across country and you see power lines off in the distance, always select the tower which is closest to your proposed flight path and fly directly over the tower. Never fly over the wires. The wires are very difficult to see, and even if you do see the wires, you won't be able to judge your height or your distance from them. A good rule to follow is all poles have wires. When making an approach into an area, don't try to decide whether that pole does or does not have wires coming from it. Just automatically make the conclusion that all poles have wires and that there will be wires coming from that pole, either horizontally to another pole or perhaps from that pole down to the ground. Also, all rivers have cables. That also applies to ravines. Again, don't try to decide whether the river is apt to have a cable stretched across it. Just assume that sooner or later, when you fly along that river, you're going to encounter a cable stretched across the river. The same thing would apply in the case of ravines. I recall an accident that occurred down in New Zealand a number of years ago, where a pilot and his shooter were flying in the backcountry of New Zealand to catch live deer, and they were flying up a ravine, contacted a cable that was stretched across that ravine. That cable was not even being used for anything. It actually had been abandoned several years before, but they had never taken it down. They struck the cable, it flipped the helicopter down into the stream below, and both men were knocked unconscious. Unfortunately, the pilot was knocked unconscious with his face below the water, and he drowned. The shooter did recover consciousness and survived. Last of all, and probably the most important rule for you to follow, stay above 500 feet AGL. It just so happens that here in the United States, the legal limit defining hazards to air navigation is 500 feet. And any man-made obstacle, which is above 500 feet AGL, is considered a hazard to air navigation and must be marked or lighted or otherwise permitted. So you can actually eliminate what is by far our number one cause of fatal accidents in the R-22 by just following that one simple rule. Always stay above 500 feet AGL. And of course there are also a couple of other very good reasons for using 500 feet as a minimum altitude. One, of course, if you're at 500 feet instead of 250 feet, you're going to have twice as much time to react in the event of an emergency. And you're going to have 4 times as great an area from which to select a potential landing site if you had to come down. And still a third reason is noise. People on the ground get very irritated with the noise of low-flying helicopters. They go to their city councils, they pass ordinances, they demand that the FAA and other government agencies pass restrictions on where they can land and where we can fly. So if we want to keep the freedom that we have in flying the helicopter where we want, landing pretty much where we want, we're going to have to be better neighbors to the people on the ground. And one of the best ways to do that is to always stay at least 500 feet AGL, and if you're flying over a noise-sensitive area, increase it up to 1,000 feet AGL. I would like to show you a video at this time. This particular video was taken in England at a birthday party. The gentleman whose birthday it was had been given as a birthday present a ride in an R-22 helicopter. The two men who owned the helicopter flew to the birthday party and proceeded to give the man his ride in the helicopter. After they had given him his ride, they both then get back into the helicopter and take off to fly back to their home base. One of the two men had his legs broken, the other man was killed. And that's the way it happens. Everything is happy, everybody's having a good time, and all of a sudden, without any warning, a horrible, tragic accident occurs, and somebody gets killed or seriously injured. Okay, we're going to take a short break at this time, and during the break you can ask any questions that you have. And I would also like to ask you to read safety notices 16, 10, and 24. You saw that low RPM rotor stall was the second primary cause of fatal accidents in the R-22. What is rotor stall? Don't confuse rotor stall with retreating blade stall. Retreating blade stall occurs in high-speed flight when the forward flight speed of the helicopter subtracts from the rotational or tangential velocity of that retreating blade. Stall occurs out toward the tip, which causes some vibration and control system problems. Retreating blade stall occurs and is much more severe in multi-bladed articulated rotors than it is in two-bladed rotors. Actually, in the case of the R-22, we don't experience retreating blade stall at all. We have a very difficult time in our certification programs even demonstrating the beginning or onslaught of it to the FAA. But what is a problem in the R-22 and in all helicopters is low RPM rotor stall. In the case of rotor stall, the rotor can no longer produce enough lift to support the weight of the aircraft. And when that occurs, the aircraft will literally fall out of the sky. What are the mechanisms of it? How does it work? Well, first of all, let's take a look at an airplane, because the rotor stall in a helicopter is almost exactly the same thing as stall in an airplane. In an airplane, the lift that's being produced by the wings is proportional to the angle of attack multiplied times the square of the velocity or forward flight speed of the airplane. The angle of attack is that angle between the chord line or center line of the airfoil and the relative wind. In other words, the air that the wing is contacting as the aircraft moves forward. Now you must understand that in a heavier than air flying machine, the lift being produced by the wings or by the rotor must always equal the weight of the aircraft in any steady state flight condition. So if I reduce the velocity or forward speed of the airplane, then the angle of attack of those wings must increase, because when multiplied together they must always equal the lift or the weight of the aircraft. For instance, to practice a stall in an airplane, I do that by coming aft with my stick, bringing the nose of the airplane up, and reducing the airspeed. As that airspeed comes down, then to produce the same amount of lift, the angle of attack must go up. As the airplane goes slower and slower, the angle of attack goes higher and higher, and finally that angle of attack will reach the critical stalling angle of attack for that airfoil under those conditions. When that occurs, instead of the air continuing to flow smoothly over the upper surface of the airfoil, the air will suddenly separate from that upper surface, will become completely confused and turbulent, and even flowing backward in close to the top of the airfoil. When the airfoil stalls, two things happen. One, there is a loss of lift. And two, and equally important, there will be a very large order of magnitude increase in drag. In an airplane, to recover from that stall, the pilot immediately goes forward with his stick or his wheel to reduce the angle of attack below the stalling angle of attack, so that he can get rid of that very large drag that has been created by the stall. At the same time, he adds power so that he can regain sufficient airspeed so that he can maintain level flight at an angle of attack below stall. That's the way that it works in an airplane. Now how about a helicopter? Well, in a helicopter it really works the same way. There's only one difference. Instead of the lift being related to the forward flight speed of the aircraft, in the case of the helicopter, the lift is related to the RPM of the rotor. And the lift being produced by that rotor is proportional to the angle of attack of those rotor blades multiplied times the square of that RPM. In a helicopter, a similar thing happens when you allow the RPM to go down. When the RPM is allowed to decrease in the rotor of the helicopter, then the angle of attack of the rotor blades must increase. As the angle of attack of the rotor blades increases, eventually it will increase to a point where the rotor blades will stall, just like the airplane wing stalls. And when that occurs, there again, there is a loss of lift and a very large order of magnitude increase in drag. In the case of the helicopter rotor, that large increase in drag acts just like a great big giant rotor brake. And where that RPM may have been coming down fairly gradually, all of a sudden when that rotor stalls, the RPM will suddenly drop immediately. And the helicopter will literally fall out of the sky. In the case of the airplane, when the wings stalled, the pilot could always recover from that stall. He could recover from the stall by pushing the nose of the airplane down and dive the airplane to reach an angle of attack below the stalling angle of attack. Even if he had to push the nose all the way down to 90 degrees, he could do it in an airplane and recover from that stall, provided he had sufficient altitude. Not so in the case of the helicopter. Once that rotor stalls in a helicopter, and the helicopter starts to fall out of the sky, there will be an upward flow of air going through that rotor that will increase the angle of attack. The relative wind, instead of being horizontal as I've indicated here, now will be coming up at a very steep angle That combined with the much lower speed of the rotor blades will increase the angle of attack to such a high value that even with full down collective, I will not be able to reduce that angle of attack below stall. Because even with full down collective, I still have typically 2 or 3 degrees of positive pitch. So that's rotor stall, and it's something which must be avoided at all costs. No matter what you have to do to maintain that RPM, you must do it. It's better to go ahead and allow the helicopter to settle into some trees or bushes or something else than to allow that rotor to stall and the helicopter to fall out of the sky. We'll take a look at a video now that was taken in England. A gentleman was out on a stroll with his video camera photographing various things, and a helicopter happened to fly over. When the helicopter flew over, he started to film it, and we'll take a look at that video now.
Can't see that much. No, I don't think it's a policeman. It's small. It's going over the top of us. It appears to have floats on it. Oh, difficult holding it in there. Coming back down to earth now. With shore in the bottom. Swinging around slowly. I'm going to go off now. Yeah, the craft seems to be coming down. We're looking now for the helicopter. He seemed to fall very rapidly from the skies. Can't see him. Any sign of him at all. There's no sign of smoke or anything, so we don't think he's crashed. It seemed very strange the way he came out of the sky. Fire engines are moving on the side road. Some people that have just passed us told us it came down at the other side of the old Seddons buildings there. As you can hear, the emergency services are trying to find a way into it. It'll be interesting when we get home to see this on the video.
The pilot had just received his license a few days before and was taking up his very first passenger, who was his wife. He wanted to show her their salvage yard from the air in their new helicopter. In the investigation, they could find nothing wrong with the helicopter, either structurally or mechanically, but the conditions were conducive to carburetor ice, and the carburetor heat had not been applied. So the investigators pretty well concluded that he probably encountered carburetor ice, and when the engine stopped, he failed to enter auto rotation. The rotor blades actually had come to a complete stop before the helicopter hit the ground. How can low RPM rotor stall be avoided? It constituted 22% of our fatal accidents. One thing you need to understand is that low RPM rotor stall, unlike retreating blade stall, can occur at any airspeed. It can occur in high-speed flight. It can occur in low-speed flight. It can occur in a climb or in auto rotation. It can even occur in a hover. And we have had fatal accidents occur in almost every one of those different flight regimes. What does a pilot do wrong that induces low RPM rotor stall? In some cases, the student or low-time pilot simply rolls the throttle the wrong way and doesn't recognize his mistake quick enough, and the RPM goes too low. Another thing that can contribute to low RPM rotor stall is the relationship between power and RPM. The power that your engine can produce is almost directly related to RPM. If you allow the RPM to droop down 10 or even 20%, then you will reduce the power that that engine can physically produce by that same 10 or 20%. And that can lead to a very unstable situation, whereas the RPM comes down, the power available comes down. As the power available comes down, that in turn will cause the RPM to fall even lower, and so on, and you end up in a very unstable divergent situation. Another thing that can cause low RPM is overpitching the collective, particularly during takeoff or during the acceleration run as you're going into forward flight. You have to be very careful that you don't pull in too much collective pitch, more collective pitch than there is power available. You need to know and practice the low RPM recovery technique, power on. If you get into a low RPM situation, power on. In order to recover from that, you must roll on the throttle and lower the collective simultaneously. If you do them separately, it won't work. If you are already power limited and you just roll in the throttle, you either will not get the RPM back or you'll get it back too slowly. On the other hand, if you just lower the collective, that will unload the rotor, which of course is good, but what else happens when you lower that collective? The correlator is rolling off the throttle. So instead of getting your RPM back, the RPM will probably drop even lower. Low RPM is more critical at high altitude. At high altitude, the rotor demands more power, and the engine can produce considerably less power. So you're in a much more vulnerable situation to end up in a low RPM rotor stall. If you're going to fly at high altitudes, before you either fly or make takeoffs and landings at high altitudes, you need to get good professional training so that you will understand the techniques that you have to follow when operating at high altitudes. What is the RPM at which rotor stall will occur? Well, your red line is at 90%, and certainly in all normal maneuvers you should never allow the RPM to ever go below 90%. However, there will be occasions when it may droop slightly below 90%. But no matter what you have to do to prevent it, never ever allow that RPM to droop below 80% plus 1% per 1,000 feet. For instance, if you're at 5,000 feet, then you would never allow that RPM to droop below 85%, and so on. Okay, we'll take a short break now so that you can ask questions. This is the power required curve for the R-22, which would be very similar for any helicopter. Here at zero airspeed, a fairly high power is required if you were hovering on a ground effect. As you start to move forward, the power required drops off very rapidly as you go through effective translational lift, and then bottoms out here at about 53 knots. Then starts back up again and goes up quite steeply as you go into high-speed flight. This point at 53 knots, where the minimum power is required, actually determines three of the basic characteristics of our aircraft. It will determine our speed for maximum endurance, because obviously we're burning less fuel at that airspeed than at any other airspeed, and therefore can stay up in the air longer. It also will tend to determine our best rate of climb speed. Because we're using the least amount of power for level flight, we have the greatest amount of power left over to climb with. And it will tend to be at or very close to our speed for a minimum rate of descent in auto rotation. If I draw a vertical line through that point at 53 knots, I can arbitrarily define everything to the left of that line as the back side of the power curve, and everything to the right as the front side of the power curve. There's a great deal of difference between operating an aircraft on the front side of a power curve and operating the aircraft on the back side of the power curve. On the front side of the power curve, everything is quite normal, natural, and stable. It takes more power to go faster, less power to go slower. For instance, if I'm trimmed out at 80 knots, and it takes 77 horsepower to maintain 80 knots, if a gust or turbulence were to momentarily speed me up to 90 knots, there it would take 87 horsepower to maintain 90 knots, but I only have 77 horsepower pulled in. So the helicopter is going to slow back down. Conversely, if the turbulence were to momentarily slow me down to 70 knots, where it takes only 67 horsepower, but I've got 77 horsepower pulled in, since I have more power pulled in than I need for 70 knots, it's going to tend to speed back up. In other words, it's going to tend to come back to its original trim condition. Okay, back on the back side of the power curve, everything is quite different. It takes more power to go slower and less power to go faster. Frankly, you have a hard time thinking of anything that works that way. Certainly an automobile doesn't work that way, a boat doesn't work that way. You have a difficult time thinking of anything that requires more power to go slower and less power to go faster. Furthermore, it's unstable. If I'm trimmed out at 30 knots, for instance, and it's taking 67 horsepower to maintain 30 knots, again, if I allow that helicopter to momentarily speed up to 40 knots, where it takes only 63 horsepower, it's going to want to speed up even more. And the more it speeds up, the more it's going to want to speed up. Conversely, if I allow it to slow down a little bit, then it's going to require even more power, and the more it slows down, the more power it's going to require, and so on. So it's unstable with power and airspeed. And this frequently gets involved in training accidents and other accidents with the helicopter. The pilot, one of the things the pilot will do wrong is he will get on the back side of that power curve where it is unstable with power and airspeed. Very quickly he'll end up at a very, very low airspeed. I would like to go into the stored energy concept of flying a helicopter now. In a helicopter, you have an engine which produces energy, and power, of course, is just the production of energy. But once that engine stops, it's absolutely worthless. It does not produce any energy, and it does not store any energy. But fortunately, there are three places in a helicopter where you can store energy. And the controls of a helicopter are such that the pilot has complete control over where he stores that energy, which storage bin he takes the energy out of when he needs it. He can even take energy out of one storage bin and put it in another if he chooses to do so. So you have a very valuable, a very powerful tool that you can use if you understand how it works. The three places that we store energy in a helicopter are in our rotor RPM, our forward flight speed, and our altitude AGL. In the case of rotor RPM and forward flight speed, we store the energy in the form of kinetic energy. or the energy of motion. And if you remember your high school physics, kinetic energy is just equal to 1/2 mv squared, where m is the mass or the weight of the object, v is its speed or velocity. For instance, in the case of the rotor RPM energy, the m is the weight of the rotor blades and their tip weights, and the v is the RPM. In the case of your forward flight speed, the m is the weight of the helicopter, and v is the forward flight speed of the helicopter. The altitude energy is stored in the form of potential energy, or the energy of height. Potential energy is that energy that I would store if I took a 1 pound weight at this height, raised it up 1 foot, I would have stored 1 foot-pound of energy. If I allow that 1 pound weight to descend 1 foot, I can recover 1 foot-pound of energy. That's potential energy. And in the case of the helicopter, the altitude energy then is just equal to the weight of the helicopter multiplied times its height above the ground. Let's look at one of the 3 energy storage bins, and this one happens to be probably the most singularly important one to the pilot. It's important for several reasons. 1, because there's a lot of energy there, and 2, because the pilot has such excellent control over the energy from this particular storage bin. This is your forward speed energy plotted versus airspeed. Now, I've chosen in this case to express the energy in terms of horsepower seconds, because I believe a pilot can probably visualize a horsepower second better than he can a foot-pound or a kilowatt-hour or some other unit of energy. 1 horsepower second of energy is the amount of energy required to produce 1 horsepower for a period of 1 second. For instance, if I'm at 90 knots, I have a whopping 800 horsepower seconds of energy stored. That's a lot of energy. That's enough energy to produce 100 horsepower for a period of 8 seconds. Even at 60 knots, I have 350 horsepower seconds of energy stored. Again, enough energy to produce 100 horsepower for a period of 3.5 seconds. However, once I allow that airspeed to get down to about 30 knots or below, I have less than 100 horsepower seconds of energy stored, and to make matters worse, I cannot even recover all of that, because I cannot flare the helicopter to 0. I may be able to flare it down to perhaps 15 knots, but not all the way to 0. So I have very little energy stored at 30 knots or below, and I cannot even recover that. So while it's extremely important in high-speed flight, still quite important at moderate speeds of 50 or 60 knots, frankly, the forward speed energy is virtually worthless once you allow that airspeed to get down around 30 knots or below. Okay, let's take a look at a typical flight condition. Let's suppose we're in a high-speed cruise at 90 knots, 500 feet AGL. This is what the stored energy picture would look like for your helicopter. In your rotor RPM, you would have approximately 100 horsepower seconds of energy stored that could be recovered. There's about 200 horsepower seconds stored there, but half of it is below rotor stall. It's there, but you can't use it, so there's no point in counting it. It's kind of like the altitude below ground level. It's there, but you can't get to it, so you might as well forget it. In my airspeed at 90 knots, I have 800 horsepower seconds of energy. And in my altitude, AGL, 500 feet, I have 1,100 horsepower seconds of energy. I actually have the most stored in my altitude. But the problem with altitude energy is that it is very slow to turn on, very slow to turn off. The pilot does not have the quick, precise control over the recovery of altitude energy that he has over the recovery of airspeed energy. So I have a total now of about 2,000 horsepower seconds of energy stored. Now let's assume that a student who is an airplane pilot, poorly trained, had a power failure under these flight conditions and did everything wrong. Let's supposing that after that power failure, he did not allow his airspeed to change and he did not allow his altitude to change. And that could happen. As an airplane pilot, he was taught that if he had an engine failure, the one thing you must never give up is your airspeed. So he may go forward with that cyclic stick to preserve that airspeed. And if the terrain below him is rather untenable, he may be very reluctant to give up that altitude. So if he did not allow either his airspeed or his altitude to change, then he would not get any energy from airspeed nor any energy from altitude. Because to get energy from those storage bins, you must allow them to change. In that case, all of the energy that would be required would have to come from his rotor RPM, where he only has 100 horsepower seconds stored. As you recall back on that power required curve, under this flight condition, the rotor is demanding about 90 horsepower. So 90 horsepower divided into 100 horsepower seconds of energy means that he would lose his RPM and stall his rotor in about 1.1 seconds. Just a little over 1 second, that RPM could go all the way down and end up stalling that rotor. Now, 1 second is about as long as it takes me to say 1001. So in a period of time, as long as it takes me to say 1001 in that period of time, that student could have lost his RPM, stalled his rotor, and been killed. On the other hand, if he entered a normal auto rotation, and let's assume that throughout that normal auto rotation, the power required is going to vary from 90 horsepower down to 60 horsepower, back up to 90 horsepower, or in other words, an average of about 75 horsepower. Then I could divide the 75 horsepower into 2,000 horsepower seconds of energy, and that would give me approximately 26 seconds before he would have used up all of his energy beyond the ground with his collective pulled in and have completed a normal, successful auto rotation. Let's take a little more critical flight condition. Let's supposing we're at 60 knots and 100 feet AGL. In this condition, we still have the same energy stored in our rotor RPM, approximately 100 horsepower seconds. We now have at 60 knots about 346 horsepower seconds stored in our airspeed, quite a bit less than we had at 90 knots, but still over 3 times as much as we have stored in our rotor RPM. In altitude, we have 220 horsepower seconds of energy. We're a total of 666 horsepower seconds of energy stored. Again, if we had a power failure from this flight condition and entered a normal auto rotation, where we were using an average of 75 horsepower through that auto rotation, we would use up the energy available in approximately 9 seconds. In other words, 75 horsepower divided into 666 horsepower seconds gives us 9 seconds that it would take for us to complete the auto rotation from this airspeed and altitude. For comparison now, let's see what it would take to recover 100 horsepower seconds of energy from any one of these storage bins, for whatever reason. If we had to recover that 100 horsepower seconds of energy, all from our RPM, we would have to allow that RPM to go from 104% all the way down to 75% in order to recover that 100 horsepower seconds of energy. On the other hand, we can recover that same amount of energy by merely allowing our airspeed to bleed from 90 knots down to 84 knots. A reduction of only 6 knots will give us that same amount of energy. Even down at 60 knots, if we allow the airspeed to go from 60 knots down to 50 knots, we will recover 100 horsepower seconds of energy. And that, by the way, is the reason why we strongly recommend that you use as a minimum airspeed for everything except takeoff and landing use 60 knots as your minimum airspeed. It's slightly above your speed for best rate of climb, but you don't sacrifice very much in the way of climb. And by using 60 knots as a minimum airspeed, you will have an additional 100 horsepower seconds of energy that you can recover anytime you need it without really going on the backside of the power curve. In other words, using 60 knots instead of 50 knots during climb out or other critical flight conditions is just like having a rotor with twice as much inertia, because you'll have that energy that you can recover anytime you need it. On the other hand, once you have allowed that airspeed to go down to 32 knots, you would have to be able to flare it all the way to zero, which you cannot do in order to recover that same 100 horsepower seconds of energy. That's why it's so important to maintain your airspeed and store that airspeed energy so you'll have it available in the event that you need it. For comparison, you will recover from your altitude energy 100 horsepower seconds of energy for each 46 feet that you descend. How does that relate to accidents? Well, one of the most common causes of accidents is a situation where the pilot has allowed his RPM to get low and he's allowed his airspeed to get low. As a matter of fact, in a study done by the NTSB for the years 1977 through 1979, a conclusion of that study was that the primary cause of accidents in all helicopters was failure to maintain RPM and airspeed. When you allow that RPM to get low, the power available from that engine will also be low. Because remember, the power that that engine can produce is almost directly proportional to its RPM. When that RPM is low, the amount of energy that you will have stored in your RPM will also be very low. When the airspeed is low, you will have gone on the backside of the power curve, back through effective translational lift, and the power being required by the rotor will have gone way up. And when your airspeed is low, the amount of energy that you will have stored in your airspeed that you can recover will also be low. One of the most common accidents that we had during the early years with the R-22 was the 180-degree practice auto rotation. And this is what would happen. The student would enter auto rotation on his downwind, just like he should, establish his rate of descent of approximately 1,500 feet per minute, a nice moderate airspeed of 60 or 65 knots. Everything would be perfect. The rotor would be getting all of the energy that it needed from that 1,500 foot per minute rate of descent, getting it all from altitude. Then the student would roll the helicopter into a 180-degree turn. Now, when he rolls the helicopter into that 180-degree turn, there's a very strong tendency for him to allow the airspeed to bleed off. If he allows that airspeed to bleed off, then he's going to recover additional airspeed energy. But the rotor doesn't need or want that additional airspeed energy because it's already getting all the energy it needs from its rate of descent. So what does the rotor do? The rotor tends to overspeed. When the student sees the rotor overspeeding, his solution is to pull in a lot of collective to hold that RPM down. He now comes around on his turn and starts to roll out of his turn. His airspeed has been bled down to perhaps 30 knots. He rolls out of the turn. He's no longer feeding the airspeed energy into the rotor, but he has all this collective pulled in that he pulled in to hold the RPM down with, and down comes the rotor RPM. The instructor now finally realizes that the student is getting into serious trouble. He takes the controls, tries to save it, but what happens when he rolls on the throttle, he does not get his normal power response because the RPM is low and therefore the power is low. The rotor in the meantime, of course, is consuming a lot more power because it has gone back through translational lift, and the power required has gone way up. The instructor does a cyclic flare to try to get the RPM back, but his airspeed is too low. Instead of getting energy back, he just follows through the cyclic flare, sees the ground coming up at him, so he pulls the collective to try to cushion the impact, but because the RPM is already so low, when he pulls that collective, he just stalls the rotor, and if anything, the rate of descent actually increases rather than decreases. He hits, and bang, bang, you have your typical training type of accident. Well, what was the original mistake made by the student that ultimately led to that accident? What started that whole sequence of events was the fact that he allowed his airspeed to bleed off during that 180-degree turn. If you have your students concentrate on maintaining their airspeed through the 180-degree turn, lowering the nose as necessary to maintain that constant airspeed through the turn, you will not feed that additional airspeed energy up into the rotor. The rotor will have little, if any, tendency to overspeed. The student, therefore, will not need to pull in that additional collective, and when he rolls out of his turn, he'll have his airspeed because he consciously maintained it, and his RPM will not be pulled down by the excess collective pitch. There is a caveat to that, however, and that is that in order to do that, the student must keep the aircraft reasonably well trimmed. Because if he allows the aircraft to sideslip or skid in that turn more than 15 or 20 degrees, then the airspeed indicator will become erratic. And his airspeed indication that he's relying upon will tend to mislead him. There's another case where we've had some accidents over the years involving this combination of low RPM and low airspeed, and that occurs during the takeoff. The pilot simply pulls in too much collective during takeoff, during his acceleration run, pulls his RPM down before he's gotten through translational lift, and finds himself in the same situation. Again, he tries to recover with power, but his RPM has already been pulled down too low and he does not get the power required from the engine. He has not gotten to translational lift, so the rotor is still demanding a high amount of power, and he does a cyclic flare to try to get that RPM back real quick, but it just falls through the cyclic flare, and when he pulls collective to try to cushion the impact, and it's at this point when he pulls collective that there is a difference in these two scenarios. When he pulls collective under these conditions, he will first get usually a nose-right rotation of the helicopter. And that's one of those things that we look for in trying to determine exactly what happened after an accident has occurred. The nose will start to rotate to the right because the torque is still being applied to the main rotor. Keep in mind now that power is proportional to torque times RPM. The power was down not because the torque was down. The torque was still right up where it should be. The power was down because the RPM was down. And power is proportional to torque times RPM. So when he pulls that collective, he still has maximum power applied to that main rotor. But his RPM is very low, and the thrust that that tail rotor can produce is proportional to the square of that RPM. For instance, if you only have 70% of your normal RPM at that point, then you're only going to be able to produce 50% of your normal thrust on that tail rotor. Whereas the main rotor is still feeling the maximum torque. So what happens is, frankly, the tail rotor stalls, and the helicopter rotates nose right, and will usually go into the cloud field or the bushes or whatever, left side first. Or in some cases, we've had a few accidents where they were trying to do a recovery while they were still a number of feet above the ground and ended up actually doing 2 or 3 complete revolutions before they would finally hit the ground. Okay, we're going to again take a short break, and during this break I'd like to ask you to read safety notices 25 and 26. Weather has contributed approximately 14% of the fatal accidents in the R-22. One of the things about the weather accidents that has been very frustrating is each of them were really due to bad judgment and the lack of self-discipline. In each case, the pilot knew that the weather was really unsafe, really unflyable, but they would get impatient, and finally, after usually standing around and talking about it for an hour or two, would finally decide to go ahead and give it a try, or go up and have a look, and that would be it. You cannot fly a helicopter such as the R-22 without outside visual references. You must have something that you're using outside that helicopter to reference in order to be able to fly it, because helicopters are unstable. They are not stable like airplanes. They are unstable and they have very high rates of roll, and if you lose that outside visual reference, you will almost immediately lose control of that helicopter. Winds and turbulence. If you were flying and you encounter high winds, and more in particular turbulence, what should you do? Well, probably the first thing you should always do would be to slow the helicopter down. Slow it down to, perhaps 70 knots or so, and steady your right arm so that you will not put in any unintentional control movements. Probably the best way is to bring your right forearm down, rest it very firmly on your right knee so that you have a good steady control over that cyclic. And then allow the aircraft to respond naturally. The R-22 or R-44 can handle turbulence very, very well if the pilot allows them to do it. Allow the helicopter to go ahead and respond to each gust or extreme turbulence, then recover with a smooth, gentle recovery of the controls. Don't chase the RPM with the collective or with the throttle. As long as your RPM and your collective are set about where they should be, go ahead and allow those 2 or 3% excursions of the RPM. They won't really hurt anything. And whatever you do, don't get on that throttle and collective and start chasing it, trying to hold a constant RPM, because you won't be able to hold a constant RPM in severe turbulence. And above all, do not over-control the helicopter. That is the most dangerous aspect of flying in turbulence, is that the pilot will start making fast, large, abrupt control movements, and he will literally drive the helicopter out of control. Carburetor ice. When we came out with the R-22, we had installed in it the standard carburetor air temperature system that's used in light airplanes, gave the pilots the same type of instructions that they would receive in their light airplane flight manual concerning the application of carburetor heat. And yet, despite this, we had a number of reports early in the program which sounded just like carburetor ice, despite the fact that the pilot insisted that he was keeping the needle out of the yellow arc. Finally, an event occurred in Minnesota that convinced me that we did in fact have a carburetor ice problem. On that particular occasion, an instructor took a student out to a practice area to do practice auto rotations, and on the very first auto rotation, when they went to pull the power back in at the bottom, the engine had stopped and they were forced to do a touchdown auto rotation. The instructor called back to the flight school, told the chief flight instructor what had happened. The chief flight instructor was very concerned, so he hopped in another R-22, flew out to the practice area, was in a hurry to get down to see what the problem was, and did a steep approach into the practice area, and when he went to pull his power back in, it wasn't there either, and he did a full touchdown auto rotation right alongside of the first R-22. In both cases, the pilots insisted that they had kept the needle out of the yellow arc, but the conditions were just right for carburetor ice. So I was convinced that we did in fact have a problem with carburetor ice. After investigating it, finally determined that there are two different physical phenomena that can cause carburetor ice. Here is a diagram of your carburetor and air induction system. The air comes in through the air filter, goes on up into the throat of the carburetor, goes up through the venturi where there is a fuel jet. As the air goes through the venturi, it is forced to speed up in the throat of the venturi, and that causes the fuel coming out of the jet to vaporize. The combination of fuel vapor and air then go on up through the throttle butterfly and into the intake manifold. The probe for the carburetor air temperature gauge is located about here and is displaying for the pilot what the temperature is at this point in the air induction system. Well, the first physical phenomenon that can cause carburetor ice is the latent heat of vaporization. And what that is that whenever you take a liquid and you convert it into a gas, it must absorb a large amount of heat just to make that conversion. Probably the most common example would be you put a pan of water on a stove and start applying heat to it. The temperature will go on up to 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Celsius, and then the temperature will stop going up. And the pan of water will just sit there and continue to absorb a large amount of heat as the water is being converted into a gas, which in this case is steam. Your refrigerator or air conditioning unit works on the same principle, where it takes Freon or some other liquid, and by changing its pressure, force that liquid to make the conversion from a liquid into a gas, and thereby require it to absorb a large amount of heat and provide the cooling for your air conditioning or your refrigerator. The same thing happens in a carburetor when the fuel coming out of that jet is forced to change from a liquid into a gaseous vapor. It must absorb a large amount of heat at that point. That heat, of course, can only really come from the induction air, and if there is moisture in that induction air, then as it is cooled by that vaporization, the moisture in the air will condense and then freeze into ice, causing ice to build up on your throttle or on your intake manifold. Okay, that is the one that you're probably the most familiar with. And the carburetor air temperature probe probably does a pretty good job as far as ice due to the latent heat of vaporization, because it's telling the pilot how much the temperature has dropped in this area. The pilot can see that on his gauge, and he can apply the carburetor heat necessary to bring the temperature back up above freezing. But there is still another totally different physical phenomenon that can cause carburetor ice, and that's what's known as Boyle's gas law. And what the gas law says is that any time you take a gas and you increase its pressure, you will increase its temperature. Anytime you expand that gas and reduce its pressure, you will lower its temperature. As pilots, you're probably most familiar with the gas law when you climb up in altitude with your aircraft. And we know that in aviation is the lapse rate. When we climb up to a higher altitude, the pressure of the air goes down. Because the pressure of the air goes down, the temperature also must go down. And of course, that's the reason why there's snow on the tops of the mountains and there isn't snow down in the valleys. Well, the same thing happens in your carburetor, particularly when you close that throttle. When you close that throttle on a steep approach or an auto rotation, you then cause a very large pressure drop to occur across the throttle butterfly. So where the pressure in here might be something approaching 29 inches, the pressure up here in the intake manifold may be cleared down to 10 or 12 inches. A very large pressure drop occurring across the throttle butterfly. With that pressure drop, there is, of course, then a very large temperature drop, 20, 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And when that occurs, again, if there is moisture in the air, it will condense and can form ice. And that ice can build up on the backside of that throttle butterfly and close off that very small air gap between the throttle butterfly and the intake and choke off the supply of fuel and air to the engine. Well, why doesn't that happen in a light airplane? They use the same carburetor, they use the same engine. Well, it probably does occur in a light airplane. But the difference is that a light airplane has that nice big propeller out there, which is acting both as a flywheel and as a windmill. And if you think back, very often when you turn base, you clear your engine, and when you clear that engine, quite often it will hesitate as you push that throttle in, and then it will start to run okay. What's probably happened is that the engine actually did stop producing power, but it continued to rotate because of that propeller, that large windmill that you have in the airplane. And when you exercised the throttle, you broke the ice ridge that had formed and, in essence, restarted the engine. In a helicopter, unfortunately, we do not have a large propeller out there to act as a windmill, and we have practically no flywheel. So when the same thing occurs in a helicopter, the engine quickly just comes to a complete stop. Now, if you had sufficient altitude, you probably could exercise the throttle and restart the engine. But unfortunately, this is most apt to occur when you're only 5 or 10 or 15 feet above the ground, and there is absolutely no time to consider any type of an in-flight restart. So that's the source of carburetor ice in the helicopter, and once we had figured this out, we did some flight tests with thermocouples installed up in the manifold. Sure enough, that's exactly what happened when I rolled the power down and reduced the manifold pressure. The temperature in this area right here would go way down. Actually, the temperature in this area would actually go up. And where I would get a 20 to 30 degree temperature drop up here, there would be a similar rise in temperature in where that CAT probe was. So once we had confirmed that, we then came out with a safety notice, changing the flight manual, and sent out to the field a little decal to put on every CAT gauge, which basically tells the pilot that whenever he's flying under conditions that could be conducive to carburetor ice, that when he reduces his manifold pressure below 18 inches, he should ignore the CAT gauge and apply full carburetor heat. Okay, we'll take another break now, and during this break I'd like to ask you to read safety notices 11 and 29. The next subject we're going to cover is low-G mass pumping, but before we can really understand low-G mass pumping, you have to have an understanding of how the helicopter is controlled and what damping is. First of all, let's talk about an airplane. In an airplane, if we want to roll the airplane to the left or roll the airplane to the right, we do that by deflecting our ailerons. For instance, if this is my left wing and this is my right wing, if I want to roll the airplane to the right, I deflect this aileron down, this aileron up, so that I produce more lift on this wing, less lift on this wing, and the airplane rolls to the right. We're all very familiar with that. And the moment being produced by that difference in lift between the left wing and the right wing is transferred to the fuselage of the helicopter through the rigid attachment of those wings to the aircraft. So that's how I control the airplane. Now, when I put in a certain amount of lateral control in the airplane and the airplane starts to roll to the right, the airplane will not continue to roll faster and faster and faster. The rate of roll will tend to be limited by the damping and roll that that airplane has. What is damping and roll? Damping and roll is the fact that when the airplane starts to roll to the right, this wing will be going down, and this wing will be going up. The downward velocity of this wing, when combined with the forward flight velocity of the airplane, will increase its angle of attack and increase the lift on this wing in proportion to that rate of roll. just the reverse will happen on this way. So that the faster the airplane is rolling to the right, the greater will be the moment produced due to this damping in the opposite direction. That will always tend to limit the rate of roll, regardless of whether that rate of roll is induced by the pilot deflecting his ailerons or just due to turbulence. So that's the way that it works in an airplane. Now keep in mind that both the control power of those ailerons and the damping in roll are dependent only on the downward velocity of this wing, or the rate of roll, and the forward flight velocity. If I do a 2G pull-up with the airplane, I can double the amount of lift being produced by both wings, but it will have no effect on either my lateral control or in my damping and roll. With an airplane, I can push the stick forward and go do a pushover all the way to 0 Gs. And again, I can bring the total or net lift from those two wings to 0, but I will not have affected my control and roll, and I will not have affected my damping and roll. I can even roll the airplane upside down and fly inverted, and I will still have the same control and roll, the same damping and roll. Now let's talk about a helicopter. Well, in straight and level 1G flight, a helicopter flies very, very similar to an airplane. But it has a very similar control and roll, and it has a very similar damping and roll. But it comes from an entirely different source in the case of a helicopter. For instance, the control and roll comes from the fact that when I put in right cyclic, I can tilt the rotor to the right, which tilts the thrust or lift of that rotor to the right. The line of thrust passing up on the left side of that center of gravity of the helicopter will produce a rolling moment to the right. Or conversely, if I put in left cyclic. So that's how I'm controlling the helicopter in roll in forward flight. The helicopter also has damping and roll, which tends to limit that rate of roll. The damping in the helicopter comes from the gyroscopic lag of that rotor. If the fuselage of the helicopter is rolling to the left, the rotor will follow, but it will follow a time increment later because of the gyroscopic lag of that rotor. The fact that the rotor will lag behind means that the thrust or lift of that rotor will also lag behind. And when it lags behind, it again is producing a moment in the opposite direction from which that helicopter is rolling. And that provides the damping which limits that rate of roll. And frankly, if we didn't have damping in both airplanes and helicopters, they would be so sensitive that a pilot would not be able to fly them. It's that damping that slows things down, limits things, and makes them controllable for the pilot. Now what happens if I'm flying along and I do a pushover with my helicopter? Well, in the case of the airplane, you remember, it didn't make any difference whether I was doing a 2G pull-up or a 0G pushover. I still had the same amount of control and roll. I still had the same damping and roll. In the case of a helicopter, because that rotor is freely hinged at the top of that mast, all of the control is coming from the fact that there is thrust or lift on that main rotor that's producing the moment about the CG. And when I allow that lift or thrust to go to 0, the control moment that I have will go to 0, and the damping and roll will also go to 0. And if I'm flying along with my helicopter and I do a 0G pushover with the helicopter, I can tilt that rotor into the oncoming air. That will reduce the thrust to 0. At the same time, that tail may go up. Since I didn't touch my collective or my throttle, I still have the same torque on the main rotor, which means I still have the same tail rotor thrust. The thrust is now well above the CG of the helicopter and will be producing a very severe rolling moment to the right. So the helicopter will start to roll to the right. The pilot sensing that right roll may be induced to put in left cyclic to stop that right roll. But when he puts in left cyclic to stop that right roll, there won't be any thrust on the main rotor, and therefore there'll be no moment being produced on the fuselage to stop that right roll. It'll have no effect. Furthermore, because there is no thrust on the main rotor, there is no damping in roll, and there will be nothing to limit that rate of roll to the right. And the helicopter will start to roll very, very fast to the right. We can show analytically that you could approach a rate of roll to the right approaching 100 degrees per second within 1 second. Now, it still has the same gyroscopic lag because nothing has changed that. The rotor is still lagging behind and is tilting to the left. And that lag, the gyroscopic lag, is about 1/10 of a second. So if the helicopter is rolling to the right 100 degrees per second, that means that the gyroscopic lag is going to be about 10 degrees. Now, if the pilot also puts in another 9 degrees of left cyclic, you are now trying to tilt that rotor 19 degrees to the left as the helicopter is rolling to the right. Well, there's only about 12 degrees of clearance built into the rotor system of the helicopter to allow for that teetering or flapping. That would be typical for the R-22 or R-44. It's also about the same on Bell helicopters. Hillers are very similar, maybe a degree or so less, but they're all in that same order of magnitude, around 11 or 12 degrees of teetering clearance. When you're trying to tilt that rotor 19 degrees to the left, then of course it's way beyond what the clearance that's designed into the hub. It's going to contact its teeter stops. The teeter stops on the R-22 are the inboard face of the spindles contacting the side of the rotor shaft. And when this event occurs, the one spindle will contact the shaft on one side. Half a revolution later, the opposite spindle will contact the other side of the shaft, and the forces are tremendous. They are so great that they can either chop that rotor shaft in two or bend the rotor shaft, and in either case allow a rotor blade to come down and strike the left side of the helicopter. And of course you have a catastrophic type of accident when that occurs. And it's maybe just a little bit more complicated than the way I described. Because as that helicopter pitches forward and the tail rotor comes up above the CG, producing that rolling moment to the right, then there's also something else which can happen. The torque of the main rotor, the rotor is rotating in a counterclockwise direction. The torque reaction from that main rotor is in the opposite direction, or clockwise. If the pilot is too late coming aft with his cyclic to reload that rotor, then when he tilts that rotor back, he will be tilting that torque reaction from the main rotor, which is in this direction. He'll be tilting it back as well. And that in turn will put a rolling moment on the fuselage due to the torque reaction of the main rotor. And it's when that torque reaction combines with the thrust of the tail rotor that you get this very, very large, very, very fast roll to the right. And that's when the event can become really catastrophic. So it's very important when you've had this feeling of weightlessness that you immediately give it a gentle aft cyclic to reload that rotor. Don't wait until the helicopter has a very high pitching velocity nose down and then put in a large amount of aft cycling. Because if you're too late, then you'll get this combination which will cause the catastrophic right roll. So it's important to recognize the fact that you have a feeling of weightlessness and immediately apply just a gentle aft cycling to reload that rotor. Low G mass bumping constituted approximately 9% of all of our fatal accidents. How can it be avoided? One of the most important things is no abrupt full range control inputs. caution new students. One thing we have found with the R22 is there are two different points at which we have a very unusual, very abnormal number of accidents, both fatal and non-fatal. And one of those 2 points occurs when a pilot takes up either a student or a potential student for a demonstration flight or for a sample or preliminary lesson flight, an initial flight. And it's on that very first flight where he's allowing the passenger or student to take the controls for the very first time. We have a very unusually high accident rate where that occurs. So before you ever allow anyone in that helicopter to take those controls, be sure that you really indoctrinate him very, very carefully, because that's one of the areas where you are most apt to have a fatal accident. Low G mass bumping, light in the seat, aft cycling. If you're performing any maneuver where you feel the least bit light on the seat, any feeling of weightlessness, immediately apply a gentle aft cyclic and reload that rotor. Never dive, lower collective. Now, an airplane pilot is very used to pushing forward on his stick and diving an airplane if he wants to suddenly reduce his altitude for collision avoidance, to avoid birds, to avoid another aircraft. And that is a very natural reaction to the airplane pilot, is to go forward with his stick and literally dive the airplane. In a helicopter, that isn't the way to avoid an obstacle or the possible collision. In the helicopter, if you want to suddenly go down, you do it with the collective, keeping the helicopter nearly level as far as its attitude is concerned. The cases that we have had of low G mass bumping, to the best of my recollection, all occurred involving a high-time airplane pilot, very low-time helicopter pilot. And it's those airplane reactions in the helicopter that can be so dangerous and are quite often have to lead to a low G mass bumping situation. Never pull up and push over. One of the ways that you can get into that weightless condition, the easiest, is if you're doing a pull-up with the helicopter and then go to level off with a pushover, you can get into that low G or weightless situation very, very quickly, very easily. So if you do a pull-up for one reason or another, be sure that you level off very, very gently with the cyclic and we're using some collective. Okay, we'll take a look at a video now that was produced by the U.S. Army. The Army did have a problem with low G mass bumping, particularly when they were performing their nap of the earth maneuvers with military helicopters. And they produced a training film to train the Army pilots how to avoid low G mass bumping. And we'll watch that film now. After the film, I would like to ask you to read Safety Notice 22 during the break.
Mass bumping? Sure, we went over that when I got checked out in the Huey. You can get it during slope landings.
Sure, I know about it. Only I call it excessive flapping. It's most likely to happen after I've shut down the engine and a wind gust causes the rotor to teeter excessively.
Actually, it's in-flight mass bumping that we've all got to avoid. Mass bumping caused by near zero-G flight, out of CG conditions, or abrupt control movements.
The functions of the Army Agency for Aviation Safety is to analyze aircraft accidents to determine causes and then make recommendations to prevent similar accidents in the future. A study of Army mishap experience involving UH-1 and AH-1 helicopters shows that mass bumping in flight can cause mass failure and complete rotor separation, producing catastrophic accidents. Analysis reveals that mass bumping accidents can be prevented provided you as a helicopter pilot understand mass bumping and know what to do to avoid it. This film will first show what mass bumping is in the Huey and Cobra, then show the in-flight conditions which can precede mass bumping, and last, and by far the most important, how you can avoid mass bumping. It may be necessary to view the film more than once, for some of the required corrective actions are counterinstinctive. It is absolutely essential that you completely understand what causes mass bumping and what to do to avoid it.
In the Huey and Cobra, inappropriate pilot response to low-G maneuvers or mechanical failure can lead to mass bumping and possible in-flight separation. As an Army helicopter pilot, you must understand the operational characteristics of the UH-1 and AH-1 and know how to handle these aircraft to avoid mass bumping. To help you understand why mass bumping occurs and what you can do to avoid it, we'll first review some of the basics of the rotor and the control systems and the aerodynamics that lead to mass bumping. We'll then discuss these factors in terms of operational flight maneuvers and describe what you, as a pilot, must do to prevent the onset of mass bumping. First, mass bumping is the result of excessive rotor flapping. Flapping is the characteristic of a rotor blade to move up and down during rotation. Flapping is common to all helicopter rotor systems and is normal and expected. The rotors of the UH-1 and AH-1 use a seesaw action about a hinge pin to accommodate flapping. To prevent the blades from contacting the tail boom or other structure during normal starts and stops, the interior of the hub is fitted with static stops. These are contoured to limit the amount of blade flap, and sufficient clearance is provided between hub and static stops for all normal maneuvers. On the UH-1, the maximum flapping angle is just over 11.5 degrees. On the AH-1, it's 12.5 degrees. If flapping exceeds these values, the stops will bump the mast. It is the violent contact between the static stops and the mast during flight that causes mass separation, and this you must avoid at all costs. A turning rotor has a constant flapping pattern. Maximum flapping up will always be opposed by maximum flapping down, 180 degrees later. At normal operating speeds, the individual blades blur into a disc shape. When this rotor disc is not at a right angle to the mast, flapping is occurring. Now let's examine how flapping can occur as a result of pilot control inputs. The cyclic control stick transmits inputs through the swash plate, changing blade pitch. The rotor disc will flap in the direction the stick is moved. So, cyclic stick movement produces rotor flap. The pilot controls the position of the rotor disc. In flight, when the rotor disc tilts, the aircraft responds by moving in the same direction. In this way, the pilot controls the helicopter. Mast bumping is directly related to how much you as a pilot allow the blade system to flap. And to understand this better, we have to dig a little deeper. In straight and level flight, blade flapping is minimal and difficult to see in real time or even, for that matter, in slow motion. Flapping angles of less than 2 degrees are expected under usual flight conditions. You can expect flapping angles to increase by 1 or 2 degrees with high forward speeds, at low rotor RPM, at high density altitudes, or at high gross weights. You can also expect increased flapping angles during turbulence. Aircraft maneuvering can also induce large flapping angles. For example, side slip and low speed flight at extreme CG positions. The risk of excessive flapping and possible mast bumping increases when you allow the aircraft to approach low G conditions. And that's what we really want to talk about. Let's see what happens when a pilot encounters a ridge line or a tree line, executes a cyclic climb, and then noses over using abrupt forward cycling. In this maneuver, he has deliberately given up G loading on the rotor disc by changing rapidly from upward to downward flight and is approaching 0 G. Higher speeds aggravate the situation. The combination of down collective and low G means that lift, and therefore thrust, has essentially disappeared. Let's look at the situation from aft along the roll axis. Absence of thrust means there is no lateral cyclic control, so cyclic movement cannot change fuselage position. The aircraft does not respond because the pilot has given up G loading on the rotor disc. The thrust of the tail rotor, acting above the helicopter's center of gravity, starts the fuselage rolling to the right. Seeing this, the pilot wants to counter the roll, normally the right thing to do. Tail rotor thrust acting above the aircraft's CG will cause right roll rate to build up rapidly. Alarmed by the excessive roll rate, the pilot abruptly applies left cyclic. The rotor disc tilts in the direction commanded by the pilot. The pilot still has rotor control, but he is controlling an unloaded rotor. That is, a rotor that is not producing thrust. Although he still has fore and aft control, he has lost roll control of the helicopter. Flapping increases drastically. The rotor hub strikes the mast violently. On one side, then the other, and the mast may separate. Let's go back to the point where the roll started to see what the pilot should have done. As we saw before, as the aircraft rolled, lateral cyclic inputs could not develop thrust because there was no change in angle of attack of the rotor system with respect to the relative wind. Consequently, there was no positive lateral cyclic control. In contrast, let's look at the situation in the pitch axis. Similar to the roll case, aft cyclic inputs cause the rotor disc to move. But in this case, the disc movement changes the disc angle of attack. Aft cyclic realigns the rotor and thrust is restored. The nose pitches up. And with thrust once again available, the pilot is able to counteract the roll. Let's make sure we all understand what the pilot should have done during the nose-over maneuver. He could have avoided the low G condition by using more gradual forward cyclic. The rate and extent of cyclic motion should be adjusted to keep the rotor loaded at all times. As a pilot, you clearly minimize the likelihood of mast bumping by staying above 1/2 G at all times, thereby preventing approach to low G and the right roll tendency. If the rotor becomes unloaded during low G, it is absolutely essential to recover thrust first by smoothly moving the cyclic stick aft. Once thrust is restored, left cyclic will then return the aircraft to the normal flight attitude. The basic lesson here is that the pilot contributes to the potential of mast bumping in the low G environment, because any pilot's instinctive reaction when a roll begins is to correct it with lateral cyclic. And the greater the roll rate, the more abrupt the control movement is likely to be. Severe flight attitudes seem to call for severe control inputs. Yet it's the severity of these inputs that can produce worse problems. If you encounter low G conditions, remember, avoid abrupt, large magnitude control inputs. Smooth, gradual control movements are essential. First, aft cyclic to restore the thrust. Then and only then, left cyclic to correct for right roll. You may also encounter low G conditions during mask, unmasking maneuvers or steep descending nose-low turns. If these maneuvers are performed with abrupt, uncoordinated, or cross-control inputs, the rapid changes from upward to downward flight may unload the rotor and induce mast bumping. The risk of mast bumping also increases in turbulence when sudden upward and downward drafts can unload the rotor and get you into low G conditions. If that should happen, you must resist the instinctive urge to counteract unusual aircraft attitudes with hard lateral cyclic and pedal inputs. You must first reload the rotor by moving the cyclic stick aft. Then, once normal G conditions have been reestablished, normal control will return. But how about another possible cause of mast bumping? Engine failure. What should the pilot do to control this situation? Again, let's get back to some basics so that we can understand what happens. First, under normal conditions, and then when the engine fails. The actions we'll be talking about are complex, so it helps to imagine there's a camera along each axis, together with one behind the cockpit. At this moment, let's say the helicopter is flying in its normal cruise attitude. That means the longitudinal axis, and therefore the nose, is pitched down slightly, and the rotor disc is tilted slightly forward. From aft, the rotor disc is tilted slightly to the left to counter the rightward thrust of the tail rotor. The roll axis is located below the tail rotor thrust axis. From above, the main rotor rotation is counterclockwise. The resulting torque would force the nose to the right if it were not for the anti-torque thrust of the tail rotor and vertical fin. The airflow over the main rotor and fuselage would tend to raise the tail if it were not for the synchronized elevator. In normal flight, then, all forces are balanced and the helicopter is in equilibrium. From the cockpit point of view, the horizon is horizontal. Most engine failures do not result in mast bumping, but it can happen if the pilot fails to take appropriate action. Let's say the aircraft is in normal flight, all forces balanced. Then the engine fails suddenly. As the engine stops, the rotor RPM and airspeed both begin to decay, with some loss in altitude. Because the engine is no longer driving the main rotor and RPM is decaying, the torque about the mast that had been opposed by the tail rotor and fin is diminishing. So now, the tail rotor continuing to thrust to the right causes the nose to yaw left. The tail rotor, located above the longitudinal axis, initiates fuselage roll to the right. In the roll axis, the left yaw has exposed the right side of the aircraft to the relative wind. Acting on the flat areas of the nose and side, the wind is aggravating the roll to the right. The pilot may see this as a nose-down tendency. The change in attitude has been abrupt and is continuing at an alarming rate. The pilot, responding to what he perceives as a nose-down left yaw situation, reacts abruptly, but in the wrong manner for the case at hand. Left, aft, cyclic, and right pedal. But he fails to lower collective. Left, aft, cyclic immediately tilts the rotor disc left and aft, and failure to lower collective results in decaying rotor RPM. This will result in larger flapping angles. Mast bumping may then occur. The remedy? Work on the primary problem, not the symptom. In this case, the symptom is the roll. The problem is power loss. So, when a loss of power is detected, you need to decrease the collective pitch to avoid a reduction in rotor RPM and apply sufficient right pedal to maintain a constant heading and enter auto rotation. But now, suppose you lose the tail rotor. In this case, the situation is practically a mirror image of engine failure. But it's further complicated because you've lost one of your primary control forces, tail rotor thrust. Let's see what happens. The instant the tail rotor fails, anti-torque thrust goes to zero, and only the fin remains to resist the torque about the main mast. The reduction in anti-torque thrust induces right yaw and left roll. Yaw attitude now exposes flat areas on the left side of the aircraft and the nose to the relative wind. This induces a roll to the left, aggravated by the absence of tail rotor thrust above the longitudinal axis that could have countered a roll in this direction. Almost instantly, the aircraft can yaw right, roll left, and pitch down. In this example, the pilot fails to lower collective to reduce the torque that is causing his aircraft to yaw. Instead, he moves the cyclic aft right again, working on the wrong thing, the symptoms, and not the problem. With the fuselage already rolling left, right cyclic tilts the rotor disc toward the fuselage and mast bumping threatens. The problem in this case is the torque tending to yaw the aircraft. The proper procedure in the event of tail rotor loss must be immediate reduction in power. You should then enter auto rotation. Power reduction will reduce the yawing tendency and therefore allow more time to correct the roll situation smoothly. With reduced throttle and collective, keep an airspeed slightly above the normal autorotative glide speed. You can experiment with gentle throttle and pitch application to see if some degree of powered flight can be resumed. But if any adverse yawing is experienced, re-enter auto rotation, continue descent, and land. For the past few minutes, we have reviewed some factors which are critical to your operation of the UH-1 and the AH-1 aircraft. We have reviewed mast bumping, what causes it, and how to prevent it. We saw that mast bumping is the result of excessive rotor flapping, and that the problem is directly related to how much you as a pilot allow the blade system to flap. We pointed out that the cyclic stick and swatch plate make it possible for the pilot to control the tilt of the rotor disc. We saw that blade flapping is minimal in straight and level flight, less than 2 degrees under usual conditions. We then discussed how excessive flapping and possible mast bumping may be caused by aircraft maneuvering, particularly when you allow the aircraft to approach low G conditions. We explained that the rotor becomes unloaded during low G. We saw that the crucial issue was the loss of rotor thrust, because it's those times when the rotor is not producing thrust that lateral cyclic movement of the unloaded rotor disc will not only fail to control the helicopter, but can result in mast bumping. We then explained how to counteract the effects of low G by recovering rotor thrust first by smoothly moving the cyclic aft, then and only then left cyclic to correct for right roll. We also examined how engine failure or loss of tail rotor can cause mast bumping and the corrective actions the pilot should take, explaining that in the case of a loss of power, you should decrease collective and apply right pedal immediately to avoid a reduction in rotor RPM. Then enter auto rotation. Now, if the tail rotor fails, immediately reduce power, then enter auto rotation. The basic lesson here, and the single most important message that should have come through, is that you as a pilot can prevent mast bumping by the way you handle the aircraft. It is absolutely essential that your control inputs be smooth and gradual, even in difficult situations such as low G, because it is abrupt and full-range control inputs combined with mechanical factors that cause mast bumping.
It is crucial that you understand the operational characteristics of the UH-1 and AH-1 rotor systems and how normal blade flapping limits can be exceeded and result in mast bumping and possible mast separation. Again, I urge that this film be rerun until each and every one of you is completely confident that you know what to do to avoid mast bumping. Mast bumping is real, but it can and must be prevented. It is vital that you understand the part you play.
Vortex ring state, we're settling with power. There have been some accidents which we have attributed to the pilot getting into the vortex ring state, more commonly known as settling with power. That occurs whenever the helicopter is descending into its own downwash. In other words, it's descending with a zero airspeed relative to the air around the helicopter. You're most apt to get into that if you do a steep approach downwind. You'll be misled by the visual sight of trees, telephone poles, and other things going by, and it will give you the sensation of forward speed. But the fact that the wind is going in the same direction that the helicopter is going in means that the helicopter will actually be descending relative to the wind or air around it at a zero airspeed, and will be going right into its own downwash, and the power required in that case, of course, goes way up. Never make a vertical descent. For instance, if you're going into a confined area, a small clearing surrounded by tall trees or something of that sort. If you're going to have to lower yourself down into that confined area, you must do it very, very slowly. You must never allow any significant rate of descent as you descend vertically into that clearing, where you can descend right into settling with power. But perhaps the best rule to remember, and if you remember this rule, you'll never have to worry about getting into the vortex ring state or settling with power. Always keep a minimum of 30 knots until the rate of descent is below 300 feet per minute. And if you follow that rule, you'll never have to worry about getting into the vortex ring state. Is the R-22 a safe helicopter? Well, yes and no. Yes, because it's a very reliable helicopter. According to the NTSB statistics, the R-22 actually has a lower accident rate due to aircraft failure or malfunction than any of the other light helicopters. So in that sense, it's a very safe helicopter. On the other hand, the R-22 is flown by student pilots, low-time pilots, recreational pilots, and as a result, has a higher accident rate due to pilot error than other light helicopters. As a matter of fact, at the beginning of the program, the fatal accident rate in the R-22 was quite high. It was actually, back in 1982, it was actually approaching 6 fatal accidents per 100,000 hours. And that, of course, was considerably higher than the fatal accident rate for general aviation. We initiated a very aggressive safety program at that time, a program which concentrated primarily on the flight instructors, because the flight instructor was the real key. We found that the flight instructors were not properly trained and didn't have the experience levels that were necessary to provide good instruction for the students. As a result of that safety program, we were able to bring the fatal accident rate down quite dramatically back in 1983, 84. And the fatal accident rate has continued to more or less drift downward ever since. And actually, during the past couple of years, the accident rate has come all the way down to where it is now, which is the lowest fatal accident rate that the R-22 has ever had. It's around 1.2 fatal accidents per 100,000 hours here in the U.S., which is actually below the fatal accident rate for general aviation. However, even one fatal accident is too many. And therefore, we need to work as hard as we can and concentrate as hard as we can on making that fatal accident rate even lower. These are a few of the rules that you need to remember to help you avoid having that horrible fatal accident. Stay above 500 feet AGL. You remember that our number one cause of fatal accidents was flying into wires or other obstacles. And that can be almost entirely avoided if you just follow that one rule. Always fly above 500 feet AGL. Avoid overpitching the collective. Remember that the number 2 cause of fatal accidents was low RPM rotor stall. And one of the primary causes of low RPM rotor stall was the pilot simply putting in more collective pitch than there was power available. The low RPM recovery technique, power on. Remember, if you get into a low RPM situation, power on. To recover that RPM, you need to add throttle and lower the collective simultaneously. You have to do them both at the same time or it won't work. Maintain a minimum airspeed of 60 knots for everything except takeoff and landing. And you remember, by using 60 knots as a minimum airspeed instead of 50 knots, is just like having a rotor with twice as much inertia. It gives you an extra 100 horsepower seconds of energy that you can use anytime you need it. No over-control in turbulence. Remember, the helicopter actually can handle turbulence very well if the pilot allows it to do it. The real danger is that the inexperienced pilot will get on the controls, be trying too hard, and will actually over-control the helicopter and literally drive the helicopter out of control in severe turbulence. No abrupt control movements. The controls in a helicopter are very, very sensitive, and all of the control motions, control movements that you use should always be very gentle, very limited. You'll find that that helicopter can perform any maneuver far better with very gentle control inputs than it can with any large or abrupt control inputs. Low G, gentle aft cycling. If you are performing any maneuver and you start to feel light in the seat, you start to have a feeling of weightlessness, you must immediately apply a gentle aft cyclic to reload that rotor. And a good rule to remember to avoid ever getting in the vortex ring state is always maintain at least 30 knots of airspeed until your rate of descent is below 300 feet per minute. If you follow these rules right here, you can greatly reduce the chances of you ever having a fatal accident.